All right, Dons, welcome to the lecture on 19.1, World War I Begins. And the objective for this lecture is to learn about the international politics that led to war in Europe. And the essential question that we're going to ask ourselves is, why did the United States finally become involved in World War I? So we left off in chapter 18 talking about United States imperialism, the Spanish-American War, and the subsequent Philippine-American War. The fact that the United States either added as a territory or as a protectorate Guam, the Samoan Islands, the Midway Islands, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. So the United States of America was experiencing their own growth of imperialism in the Western Hemisphere, but the same thing was happening over in Europe, especially since many of these European powers no longer had access to Central American and South American countries, because the United States, through the Monroe Doctrine and then the Roosevelt Corollary, had basically made sure they were going to keep Europe and European business out of the Western Hemisphere. So where does Europe turn? Europe begins to turn to Asia and to Africa. And the fact that all of the different European countries are trying to colonize in Asia and Africa, this is going to lead to competition, conflict, and a lot of tension throughout Europe. Now, there are four major reasons for the outbreak of World War I, which began in August of 1914. The first one is nationalism. Now, nationalism is the idea of putting national interest and unity above all else. And that becomes extremely important in World War I. All of the countries involved, Italy, France, Britain, the United States, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Serbia, Ottoman Empire, all of them act in their own self-interest. The entire point of all of these countries getting involved is to act in their own self-interest. Throughout this time in Europe, or during this time throughout Europe, different European nations had created alliances with each other. Britain had an alliance with France in which they would help France in armed conflict. France had an alliance with Russia. Germany had an alliance with Austria-Hungary. And Russia had an alliance with Serbia. It all gets pretty confusing, and I'll explain more as the lecture goes on. But one of the reasons that all of these countries had alliances was to protect their national interest, to make sure that if they were threatened, they had a system in place that would protect what was best for them. The second reason, imperialism, which we talked about a lot last unit in the Western Hemisphere with the United States of America, but it was also happening, like I mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture, in Europe. And Europe was competing over colonies, like once again, in Africa and in Asia. For example, the Russo-Japanese War, which was a war in the early 1900s, 1904, 1905. This was a war between Russia and Japan, but it was a war over the colonies of Korea and Manchuria. So you can see that two major powers have already come into conflict over colonization. And if you remember, Teddy Roosevelt famously negotiated an end to this conflict and won the Nobel Peace Prize for it. But if you were doing things in your national interest, like colonizing and becoming wealthier, becoming more powerful, creating an alliance system, and you're becoming an imperialist country, then you're eventually going to need a military to help protect all of these colonies that you are adding to your empire. So the development of armed forces and their use as a tool for diplomacy became very popular in the early 1900s. These militaries were building up, and because all of these countries had such strong militaries, they figured they would use their military as a use of diplomacy as opposed to actually negotiating. So when Britain saw how much the Japanese and the British were building up their navy, the Germans. When the Germans saw how much the Japanese and the British were building up their navy, the Germans decided to build up their navy too. When the United States of America saw how much these countries were building up their navy, the U.S. decided to build up their navy. recognizing that this is really becoming an arms race between all of these countries involved in colonization throughout the world. And then lastly, something I mentioned a couple times, the alliance system created a real domino effect in Europe, and something you learned about last year in world history, but I will touch on once again in this lecture. So, although this is a U.S. history class, I think it's important to remind you just how did World War I begin and why did it begin? Well, the Balkan region, which is this region right here, north of Greece, southwest of Russia, and southeast of Central Europe, okay? This region was nicknamed the powder keg of Europe. And the reason it was nicknamed the powder keg of Europe is you had a lot of people living in this region who identified themselves as a nationality different from the government in which they lived under. And the example we're going to be using for this specific instance is the fact that the Bosnians were being annexed. Bosnia was being annexed by Austria-Hungary. So the Bosnians, those that lived in Bosnia, had to actually listen to or follow the laws of Austria-Hungary. Well, Bosnia had a lot of Serbians, or Serbs, living in Bosnia. And Serbs were a Slavic people, very similar to Russia. Serbia had an alliance with Russia at this time, and the Serbians were telling the Serbs in Bosnia not to follow the laws of Austria-Hungary. I know it's all confusing. Feel free to rewind about 30 seconds if you need to go over it again. But basically, the Serbians were telling those Serbs in Bosnia not to follow Austria-Hungary. What ends up happening is Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir apparent in Austria-Hungary, is in Sarajevo, Bosnia. And he's doing a tour, a little parade, waving to the crowd and everything else. And without getting into a huge amount of detail, because this is a U.S. history class, Gavrilo Princip, who's a Serbian terrorist, member of the Black Hand terrorist organization, killed both the Archduke and his wife. What this does is this infuriates Austria-Hungary, makes them angry at Serbia because Gavrilo Princip was Serbian, and Austria-Hungary then declares war on Serbia. But like I just mentioned a moment ago, the people of Serbia are Slavic. They identify themselves with the people of Russia. So when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia said, well, we're going to back up Serbia and we are going to declare war on you, Austria-Hungary. But Austria-Hungary had an alliance with Germany. So Germany said, well, we're going to join this war and we're going to declare war on Russia. On top of that, we know that Russia has an alliance with France, so we're also going to declare war on France at this time. The Ottoman Empire begins to get involved because they are allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Great Britain is allied with France, and they get involved, especially when Germany marches through neutral Belgium. So when it's all said and done, the Central Powers, or the Triple Alliance, was between primarily Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The Allies, or the Triple Entente, had France, Great Britain, and Russia. It will also add Italy in 1915 because the Triple Entente, or the Allies, basically promised to give Italy land back if they win the war. And of course, this will also add to the United States of America. But this is a world war, and you have to remember there's fighting going on in the Dardanelles regions. There's fighting going on in the Western Hemisphere, Central and South America. There's fighting going on in Africa. So this is truly a world war at this point. So, why does the United States get involved in this war? It's very critical to understand that when this war broke out, many citizens within the United States of America did not want to get involved in this war in any way. This was a European war. There's a popular song at this time saying how American women did not raise their boys to go fight and kill some other mother's son over in Europe. Americans didn't want to get involved. They didn't think it was the right thing to do. They didn't feel like it was necessary. So for the first 2.5 years of this war, the United States of America is neutral. That is our official diplomatic position during this war. Eventually, as you probably know, we do get involved in this war. And now it's time to talk about exactly why the United States of America ends up getting involved in this war. Woodrow Wilson, who we've talked about quite a bit last unit, was President of the United States from 1912 to 1916 in his first term, and he runs for re-election in 1916. And he actually runs on the campaign slogan of "He kept us out of war." And soon after he was re-elected, he actually got us involved in war. Although he got us involved very begrudgingly, something that Woodrow Wilson did not want to do. And so Wilson wins re-election in 1916 on a promise of peace. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and I have here, Germany declares unlimited submarine warfare, and the Sussex Pledge is void, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But I do want to point out that during this time, Britain and Germany are going back and forth on blockading each other's shipping lanes and ability to get supplies and food to their countries. The British blockade of Germany in the North Sea ended up killing 750,000 people in Germany. It caused an enormous famine in Germany, and actually was one of the primary reasons that Germany had to pull out of the war when it did. The German government and the people, the German government was collapsing, the people were starving, and they were demanding an end to the war. Now, most people don't realize the huge effect that the British blockade was having on Germany because it was happening within Germany. But from an American's perspective, what Germany was doing to Britain was much more noticeable and much more exciting, not in a good way. It was exciting American emotions to enter the war against Germany. And so when Britain blockaded Germany, Germany decided that they were going to respond with their own blockade, and they were going to use U-boats, or basically submarines, to counteract the Britain blockade. And they said that they would basically, any ship, whether it be a merchant ship, a military ship, a passenger ship, any ship that comes close to the British Isles is going to be fair game. It can be blown up, and they don't necessarily have to tell the people on board that they're going to do it. Germany actually shoots at multiple ships carrying American citizens, one of them being the Lusitania, in which 120 plus Americans died, the sinking of the Lusitania. At one point, the United States of America and President Wilson demanded that Germany not shoot ships any longer, and Germany agreed. In the Sussex Pledge, they agreed to do that. And Wilson thought that after he convinced Germany to avoid shooting at merchant ships, he could actually get Germany and Britain and other European countries to come to some type of ceasefire and some peace in all of this. But Germany, after thinking about it, realized, you know what? We think we can actually win this war if we keep doing this, so we're going to keep doing it. And the Sussex Pledge was void, and Germany continued to fire on our ships. We began to arm our merchant marine ships to defend ourselves, but America's not at war yet. Wilson is determined to keep us out of war, although he is publicly condemning Germany for what they're doing. But later, on March 1st, 1917, the Zimmerman Note is discovered, in which British agents actually intercepted a note that talked about Germany potentially allying with Mexico. If America entered the war, Mexico would then declare war on the United States of America. Germany would use Mexican ports to help the Mexicans fight against the U.S., and then they could reclaim the land that they lost in the Mexican-American War in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Well, the United States of America was furious when they found out that Germany was trying to deal with Mexico behind their back, and then on top of that, just in the next 2 days after the Zimmerman Note was discovered, Germany sunk two more ships that carried Americans, and Woodrow Wilson, much against what he wanted to do, realized that he begrudgingly had to declare war and had to enter World War I. And on April 6th, just a little over a month after the Zimmerman Note was discovered, the United States of America enters war. On January 8th, 1918, Wilson's 14 points were given at an address in which Woodrow Wilson outlined exactly what he wanted for this war. He wanted a peace without victory. He did not want clear winners and clear losers, because he knew that would just create more tension and more animosity in Europe. So as America fights in this war, Woodrow Wilson believes we are fighting on an idea of peace without victory, an idea of the war to end all wars, which is one of the nicknames of World War I. This will become very important because at the end of the war, Woodrow Wilson demands that we adhere, everyone involved in this war, adhere to this idea of peace without victory. But Britain and France, so angry at Germany for being involved in this war and dragging them in, refuse to let Germany off the hook. And this will create tensions that will eventually lead to World War II. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves now. Following 19.1, the United States has declared war on Germany. They joined Britain and France and Russia in this fight, and we'll get into the fighting in more detail at 19.2. If you have any questions, feel free to ask your history teacher.